Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. Finnish President Alexander Stubb has suggested that European support in securing the Strait of Hormuz could be linked to increased U.S. backing for Ukraine. Now, the proposal comes as some European allies, including Germany, have ruled out military involvement in the region, reflecting differing positions within Europe. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte warned while he attended NATO exercises in Norway that allies must be prepared for a potential future challenge from Russia, underscoring broader security concerns facing the alliance. We're now joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin, to discuss it all further. Good to have you back with us. Good morning.
Thank you so much, Sascha.
So this proposal, this idea that the Finnish president has raised now, I mean, there isn't really any direct reaction yet from Washington. How, let's say, effective can this sort of idea be?
Well, I think Washington's got a lot on its hands this morning after the escalation with Israel's attack on the world's largest gas field in southern Iran, and Iran retaliating this morning with attacks on energy plants across the Gulf. But even if this was considered, I think it would be a non-starter for the Trump camp for two reasons. Simply, first of all, they don't want to tie their hands in terms of making any commitments regarding where they go next in the Gulf, even though they're in a difficult position, including regarding the Strait of Hormuz. But secondly, and I think your colleague referred to it in the newspaper roundup a few moments ago, the Trump folks' priority right now is that they don't want to do anything to offend Russia in terms of the so-called talks, even though those talks have been suspended. So I can't see the Trump camp saying, okay, look, we're in real difficulties here over the Strait, therefore we're going to ramp up our military supplies to Ukraine, or suddenly swing behind Ukraine's position regarding, for example, the status of Donetsk in the east of the country.
So also in that same sort of direction, we've had someone who very much has been one of people, I call him the Trump whisperer, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who's been also rather quiet in terms of his reaction, especially to Trump's criticism of the alliance just a few days ago. Now in Norway, he also uttered, I think, some kind of reaction about this idea, saying that allies are discussing, will collectively find a way forward. I mean, what's his strategy in all this? I mean, obviously there's the public and then there's the private discussions, but what is his position in all this, you think?
Well, publicly, I mean, Rutte is not just a Trump whisperer, he's a Trump cheerleader. He is, most vocal in terms of praising Trump, even calling Trump daddy, just this idea that he has to keep the U.S. president on side. I think privately, what you have is European countries and, of course, NATO, with its many European members, are simply having to make planning on that the way forward, in large part, will be without political support from the Trump folks. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't get U.S. military support. It's really important to emphasize that a lot of American career military personnel, career military planners, they are there in NATO headquarters. That cooperation is not suspended. And the knock-on effect, with so much of U.S. military resources being expended in the war on Iran, is that those American military planners have got to look to Europeans and say, look, how do we make sure that NATO's defenses in Europe are not depleted because of this, that there's no effect on us? So I suspect those discussions will be going on quietly, even though Rutte is not going to say anything to try that might unsettle Trump.
And then also, I mean, not about unsettling Trump. Let's look at the alliance again. And we've had this suggestion by the Finnish president, although we don't have any super tangibles. But at the same time, we have countries that have ruled out any sort of major involvement, including France, including Germany. I think the German chancellor just said, well, Germany will not take part as long as the war continues. So how do we balance that? At what point do we have, let's say, critical mass of allies in NATO or in Europe to actually have a combined policy, or will this always be back and forth?
This will be the easiest question of the interview. I mean, there is only one country that said they might even consider sending their naval forces into the Strait at the moment, and that's UAE, the Gulf state. The fundamental line from European states is, look, we will consider an international force to protect shipping in the Strait once there's a ceasefire. Now, quite often that'll be framed as de-escalation rather than ceasefire, but that's what they're talking about. And that makes sense, because why would you send your naval forces into a war zone where they could become a target of the Iranians? We saw in the 1980s that the United States ran into serious trouble on its own, trying to maintain the Strait with an American warship attacked by Iraq, killing 37 sailors. And then the U.S. months later, downing an Iranian passenger jet, thinking they were about to be attacked, killing almost 300 Iranians. And so, Europeans are mindful of that experience, and they're mindful of the fact that, patrolling the Strait is an extremely complex operation and one that is not without risk.
Mm-hmm. But also, speaking of risk, I'm curious. I looked into a little bit of the history of NATO. There was one operation. This is around the Horn of Africa, Allied Protector, I think it was called, around 2008 to 2016. Now, that was a NATO task force. That was about anti-piracy operations. But do you sense in any way possibility that something like this could take shape around the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, I think there's even a more recent parallel, which is EU in 2024 started the Aspides operation for shipping in the Red Sea. Now, that's because the Houthis, the Iranian allied insurgents who control about 2/3 of Yemen, were firing on shipping there during the Israel war on Gaza. But that was a relatively small EU operation. And the firepower of the Houthis is a fraction of what the Iranians, even though they have been depleted by the attacks, is a fraction of what the Iranians could still bring with the missiles, the drones, as well as the operations to lay mines in the Strait. So no, I recognize that there are precedents and that there have been operations to protect shipping, but nothing on the scale that we would have to consider here.
Okay. And also, you mentioned the European Union. That major summit is due to kick off today in Brussels, bringing all those leaders of the European Union together. There'll be many, many issues, a whole plethora of things. What do you think, in terms of any sort of clarity, can we get out of this? Will there be a unified policy of European leaders with Iran?
Oh, with Iran, look, there will be a unified line, which will be that we denounce Iran's retaliation. They'll be more careful about specifically criticizing U.S. operations, but they'll call for de-escalation. But look, the fundamental here is that Europe, and specifically the EU, don't have much leverage here. Despite the fact they have interest in the Gulf, they're not the states that could swing Donald Trump to try to get him to pull back from this operation, even though there are serious issues now. The Gulf states have some leverage, especially with the escalation of the Iranian attacks on them. Turkey may have a bit of leverage, but right now, until you get Trump to accept the fact that the economic cost of this operation and the domestic pressure of this operation is going to eventually outweigh his wish to simply blow up stuff, until that happens, we're stuck in this limbo of a conflict, which is going to be an uncontained war for at least days, if not weeks to come. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned also other countries there, international powers. Let me also press that on you as well. Back to Brussels, where apparently there will be Chinese military officials. They're heading to Brussels. This comes actually at the same time of that announcement we heard that the Chinese, that summit between Trump and Xi Jinping is actually postponed. Is that a coincidence, or was this always on the cards?
Look, this is the wider framework here, which is that international affairs is being completely realigned. And this has been the case throughout the duration of the Trump administration. Now it's being realigned militarily because of, you talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you talk about Israel, Gaza, now the war on Iran. It's being realigned economically because of Trump's tariffs and because of his unwillingness to uphold the international economic order, and it's being realigned politically because the Americans the Trump folks at least, don't believe in alliances. So all of a sudden, China, which of course, is always a potential adversary, now it's a potential partner for the Europeans. It's a potential trading partner to try to come out of what has been a fairly chilly period in EU-China relations. It is not a political partner necessarily, but you can move towards coexistence. And militarily, you want to make sure that the Chinese do not exploit what is happening in the Gulf to ramp up any threats in the Pacific, the Asia-Pacific area, Because let's remember, the Americans are actually having to draw down their forces in the Far East to try to maintain the Gulf effort. And you don't want the Chinese thinking, this is our opportunity to put a little bit of pressure on Taiwan and on the South China Sea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but also, I mean, we've talked about it before, and there is obviously a trading relationship between China and many of the European Union member states. But do you sense that, is this something building? I mean, we talked about adversary, partner, etc., all these different labels, but in your assessment, is this more China, let's say, getting more of a foothold strategically in Europe? Will that be the trade-off? Or maybe is that because the war that Donald Trump has been involved in is maybe a mistake?
Yeah, look, there was an expression, we've had expressions like competitive coexistence, that have run for decades with China. And the fundamental here is that if Europe is in a position where it feels like it cannot rely on the Americans and that it faces economic, military, and political challenges, it's going to rethink how it looks at China. China's going to look at the Europeans and think, okay, we have opportunities here not to confront Europe, but possibly to advance our economic interest and to try to make this a win-win with the Europeans. And China's also thinking, let's be honest here, we take off some of the pressure that European states had applied regarding Chinese technology, regarding China's operations in fields such as AI. Now, as long as you have that win-win possibility between Europe and China, then I think both sides pursue it. If China ever again posed the threat, to be honest, that the Trump folks are posing right now, then that would shift. But, all of a sudden, competitors become a little bit different the way you look at them when your allies have basically abandoned you.
Mm-hmm. And also, I want to get your sense quickly. I mean, this happened, I do believe, yesterday. I mean, the resignation of the U.S. head of counterterrorism, basically then saying publicly he cannot, in good conscience, still remain in his post. How does that impact all of this? I mean, that's significant. Someone in the administration stepping down. Yeah,
and Joe Kent was a diehard Trump supporter. But what happened here is that Joe Kent, head of the National Counterterrorism Center, he's also part of that Trumpist faction that actually has turned against Trump over the U.S. relations with Israel. This includes prominent commentators like Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, for example. And Joe Kent decided, look, that it was Israel that was actually, in a sense, directing U.S. policy or heavily influencing policy here. And that's why he makes the high-profile resignation and now is giving interviews, including with Tucker Carlson last night, to press this point, which is that he doesn't see this as a war in the U.S. interest. He sees it as a war in Israel's interest. I think that might resonate with some Americans, but I think it'll be limited because of Kent's own background, that he, in effect, is coming out of this Trumpist background. So I think it's more of evidence of a split amongst what we call the MAGA movement, rather than a wider shift of public opinion in the U.S.
All right, so still various shifts happening all the time here. Look, thanks for covering all those topics with us here. Always a pleasure. Scott Lucas there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sascha.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.